Hi and welcome to the Neil Ashton podcast. In each episode, we explain some of the fascinating ways that science and engineering are changing the world around us. We talk to leading engineers from elite level sports like cycling and Formula One, to some of the world's top academics to understand how fluid dynamics, machine learning, supercomputing are bringing in a new era of discovery. We also hear some of their life stories, their career advice, and lessons they've learned on the way that I hope will be helpful to you too. So sit back and enjoy this episode. Welcome back to the Neil Ashton podcast. Well, today is actually the last episode of this first season, so it's going to be a short one, really just to say thank you, I suppose, to the people who have listened to this first season, which has gone on a journey, I guess. Certainly myself, I wasn't sure whether anybody would even listen to these episodes, and purposely picked a range of guests and topics that were quite broad, and I really wanted to see what people liked the most, what was interesting to them, and also reflects, I guess, the broad taste and interests that I also have. So I also wanted them to go into a reasonable amount of detail, and so probably, as you've seen, they have been quite long. I think the longest one was with Professor Tony Purnell, and that was over 2 hours. I think for some of them I managed to keep it a little bit shorter, so just a couple of hours, just an hour or so. But I was a fan of the long form podcast because really, to hear people's stories, you kind of have to, do it over time, and it's difficult to edit and condense it down to just, 7 minutes. So I know that YouTube says you should never make videos that long, but yeah, I wasn't as concerned about that. And I'd be interested actually to know whether people tend to listen to this on Spotify or Apple, or tend to watch it. When I created these being an hour or 2 hours, my assumption was that people would listen to it. So if you are watching this on YouTube, I appreciate that a 1 or 2 hours on YouTube is quite long. So if you are watching it, I would recommend that you instead perhaps search on Spotify or Apple for this podcast, because I personally think listening to it actually is it's better. So yeah, I just want to briefly sort of recap and maybe even remind people what, who I've spoken to, what I've covered, and a little bit about the future. So yeah, this is the last episode. I've done 13 episodes for this season. So I'm going to take a bit of a break for a month or so over August. Got some really exciting people to speak to already for the next season. But I thought I'd give it a little bit of break. It gives me a chance to focus on some other stuff for a little bit and do a better job at taking a step up, trying to make these maybe a bit more professional, get even, broader range of speakers, and also take some feedback on what people liked or didn't like. So I'm hoping it will come back in the second season with an even better podcast that can be even more enjoyable and worthwhile listening to. But yeah, who did we speak to at the beginning? So Dr. Florian Mentor, that was essentially the first episode, but technically it's episode 2 because the first was a podcast intro. And I really enjoyed that conversation. I think it was actually one of the most popular ones because Dr. Florian Mentor has been one of these pioneers of CFD, and has, as I mentioned in the episode with him, has stayed reasonably quiet in a way, even though he's very well known. He's kind of, not attracted the light and not wanted the limelight. So I think a lot of people liked that episode because it really gave them a better understanding of who he was, what he's done, and some of the history around those, turbulence models and CFD. So that was really an episode focused on the CFD and even the turbulence modeling sort of community, and I was pleasantly surprised how many people actually were interested in that one. So if you haven't listened to it already, I would go back and maybe take a look, because it might be interesting for some. The third episode was with Professor Tony Purnell, and that was, like I said, one of the longest ones, and I would really encourage people to listen to it. Okay, listen to it, maybe not watch it, because Tony had done so many things. I mean, it's hard for me to describe. For someone to have run a Formula One team, then being at the top of the FIA, then being in charge of the British cycling project for, more than 4 years through the whole Olympic cycle, and being a professor at Cambridge University, and having had a very successful business that he sold, for quite a lot of money. He's done so many things, and he's again one of these people that if he wanted to have done, he probably could have, spoken louder and got more media attention. But he stayed a bit, quieter. And so he's probably not as well known to people, but I would argue that what he's actually done puts him up there with, some of these really top engineers. So again, that was a great one for me. And actually, Tony is someone I really looked up to because we actually worked together on the British cycling. And maybe what I didn't say is that, that really was an important point in my career because it gave me a real insight into a sport I really like. I enjoy cycling myself, but I learned so much from it, and it helped me then when I went on to do things with Formula One or other things later. I really learned a lot from that, and it opened the doors for many things and expanded my network. So I was really appreciative to Tony, who gave me the chance, to work on that project. And it was Tony, but it was also other people within the British cycling, realm. Some people who still work for British cycling now and still do other things like Chris. But yeah, that was an episode, and I hope you may go back and listen to that because I thought that was a good one. The fourth one was my attempt to do something a little bit different, and the title was Academia or Industry, PhD or no PhD. And I wanted to give an experiment to do something a bit different. So rather than just interviewing somebody, I thought I'd do it on my own this episode and discuss something that's quite close to my heart, which is this decision that many people go through of, do I try and progress through academia to become a professor? Do I go into industry? I get a lot of questions, is it worth doing a PhD financially and, for life reasons? So I really went into some detail, and I was pleasantly surprised how many people valued having some of that feedback. And I think I'll try and do a few more for the next season. So I'd be interested to know, reach out to me if you have ideas of topics to cover. But that was one that really tried to pass some of the knowledge that I've gained, which is not complete by any means, but it was a bit of a solo one. In the description of the podcast, I often talk about Formula One, cycling, how it links to machine learning and engineering. And so episode 5 was with Dimitri, who is one of the world's top bike designers. And so it was a chance for me to revisit that cycling theme, something that we will also be doing more of in the next season. Something I've got a passion for. There's lots of more areas we can explore. So we're going to focus a lot more on some of the aerodynamics in the next season and talk to some people from some of the cycling teams. But Dimitri's conversation was really interesting if you're into bikes and the way that they operate and the mentality of how you design a race-winning bike. So that was episode 5. 6 was with Juan Alonso. So this was a bit like the Florian Mentor one, was again a CFD-focused episode. Juan Alonso has created this startup, Luminary Cloud, and I think it's a good opportunity to hear from someone who has taken his findings from academia and tried to create a startup out of it. And I personally found that interesting because there's quite a few startups around now in the CFD space. So if you listen to that episode, you'll get a bit of a sense of what drove him to do it and why he's doing it. And he's also a really nice guy, and I think a lot of the lessons and things that he spoke about are useful for many people. I keep switching back and forth between more deep dive in sort of academia or CFD and then more the applications of it. So the 7th episode was with Pat Simmons. He was kind enough to invite me to his house where we did the interview, and annoyingly the audio didn't work out that well for me. So it was the first time doing an actual in-person interview. But, hearing his story, his way of rising up through the ranks to arguably, one of the top positions in Formula One, he's another person that was really crucial for my career because he took a bit of a gamble, I think, in having me to be a consultant for Formula One. A bit like Tony Pennell, these people who I'd like to think were had an eye on trying to help the next generation come through. And so, Pat didn't have to do it. He could have, gone with someone far more experienced or older. But I really appreciate the trust he put in me. And I'd like to think that I gave them some insights from, what's going on in the world and cutting edge CFD. And since then and still now, I really value Pat and all that he's done for my career. And so I was always wanted to speak to him more about what he's done in his life. And so this podcast was a great opportunity to go and speak to him. So again, that if you're really into F1, that's a good one to listen to. I pivoted from the Formula One then to speak to Jack Dongara, which was all about high performance computing. Actually, high performance computing is something that I've more and more focused on, particularly in my day job at Amazon. And it's one of those topics that I feel I didn't know as much about before I joined AWS. And it's become something I find very interesting because it touches many fields. It's not just CFD, it's, weather forecasting, drug discovery, machine learning. And so it's something I think is useful for people to know about because the computing side of it is actually quite important in almost any area of simulation or engineering. It's really what is the driving force behind so many of our things today. If you look at Gen AI or these large language models, they wouldn't exist if you didn't have a supercomputer to train these models. So that was a good episode with him, and he was kind enough to speak to me, and we tried to look a little bit towards the future. It may go into a little bit of technical detail, into the HPC world, but I think it's something good to know more about. The next episode 9, was with Chris Rumsey, and he's another person who I personally looked up to, and again has helped me a lot, inviting me welcomed me into some of these aerospace activities. A lot of my background has been in automotive, but I've always loved aerospace and space. And I didn't come from that world per se. Although I did work for NASA a little bit, nothing like people like Chris and others who are, full-time employees at NASA. And Chris has always been very good to me, and I've learned a lot from him, and I really, admire him as a person. We worked quite closely over the past few years in some of these things called the High Lift Prediction Workshop with NASA and Boeing and others. And again, I was always intrigued to know a little bit more about Chris. And so this episode was like many episodes. It's, the secret here is there's an opportunity for me to speak to people I like to hear from as well. So that was a good episode, a bit similar to Florian Mentor and Juan Alonso, a bit of a CFD focus. But if you haven't listened to it already, hopefully you'll enjoy it. Now, the past 3 or technically 4 episodes have dived into this AI for science, and this really is a sort of mini series. I started off with me giving some of my thoughts. It was a bit of a quick episode, really. It was more just to sort of frame some of the discussions, and it's all about trying to look at if machine learning could be a revolutionary thing. It's certainly it's a bit of a hot topic, and one that divides people. Some people think, it's a load of rubbish, this machine learning. We've been doing it for 20, 30 years. It's just got a different name. And there are others who are far more bullish. So what I thought I would do is I would, try and speak to some of the top people in the world. And instead of me giving my opinion, how about trying to, and also instead of just one person giving their opinion, if I speak to 3 different people, hopefully we can get a broader sense of what the community is thinking. So I purposely tried to speak to them. So Max Welling is actually a very well-known person in the machine learning world. I don't come from the machine learning world, but if you even start to look into it, you'll see Max Welling is like one of the top guys. I mean, he was a VP at Microsoft, one of the top people running their research department. he was pioneering with things like autoencoders, which, if you're into machine learning, you'll realize is a building block of so many things. And he's turned his hand to the AI for science realm. And he's a very smart individual. He's in many of these workshops and committees and reviewers for journals. So he's literally one of the top people. I was kind of amazed that he even said yes. I was so pleased that he said yes. And I liked that episode because I genuinely learnt things from that. And it was good to get his opinion on the potential of AI for science. The next one, but Max Welling is not a fluid dynamics specialist. That's not actually his background. He comes more from the pure ML world. Whereas then I spoke to Karthik in episode 12, who comes from a more similar background to me, more of a sort of CFD or turbulence modeling background, but has turned himself to really focus on machine learning applications. And that was a good one because I felt that gave an even more useful insight into how it could be used for fluid dynamics and CFD and aerodynamics, which is obviously kind of the theme of this podcast. I do try and cover other topics, but as you probably noticed, it's aerodynamics, computational fluid dynamics, anything to do with engineering, essentially. And so Karthik gave a very insight. He was, I would say, a realist almost, or someone who realized that AI has its place, but he wasn't trying to claim it could, do everything. But he's been focusing a lot on these things called foundational models, which is very interesting. The final episode was with Anima, who is, again, very well established in the field. He's highly influential. And as I said in the episode, has held very senior positions at companies who are really putting the money behind a lot of this stuff, like AWS and NVIDIA. And of course, being, a full professor at Caltech. And she has really been the one pushing some of the debate. And so I wanted to hear her as well. Now, as I alluded to, she's a bit more bullish. She's more confident of what we can achieve, probably more so than Max and Karthik. But I wanted to have, that blend of it. So that's where we are. We're at today. Those 13 episodes have come out. What would I like to do in the next season? What's to come? Well, I would like, and I'm going to expand and try it some more into the engineering side. So some of the topics that we're going to cover in the next season will be things like hypersonics. What are the challenges? Why is hypersonics so important to the world? What are the, science challenges with hypersonics being more than Mach 5, so very, very fast. I want to get into supersonic planes, so things like Concorde. Could something come back again? Going to double down on some of the CFD. So we've got some really amazing legends of the CFD world to speak to. Formula One, of course, some really big figures in Formula One who will be recording with in the next few weeks. And cycling, I want to get into in a more deepening way. So it's not going to be that different than the first episode, than the first season. But I do want to tackle some what I think are very interesting engineering challenges. And one of the final things we're going to cover is some of the things to do with space, which has always been something I've loved. So, getting to Mars, what are some of the challenges and things like that. So, but I'm flexible and I'm trying to be guided by what people listening to this want, not just myself. So if you have some ideas, please go to the YouTube. It's probably the easiest way, and put a comment under, let's say, this video or any of the videos on what you may like or what you disliked, or on LinkedIn. If you follow me on LinkedIn and send me a message with feedback or ideas, then I'll definitely take it into account. So yeah, thanks again. Really appreciate people getting involved and listening to this. I'm pleased that it's resonated with some of you. Very happy about that. And hope I can do it again for season 2. But for now, that's it. Gonna have a bit of a break, and I'll probably see you again in September. So thank you for listening and watching.